Debt is like a slow-moving rot. It eats the edges of your life until there is nothing left but the bone-dry panic of survival. I didn't take this job for the advancement of science or the prestige of the position. I took it because the bank was a wolf at my door, teeth bared and dripping with the black ink of my overdue notices. They called it consultant engineering, but the reality felt more like a prison sentence served in the middle of a saltwater void. The transport boat was a rusted, windowless coffin that smelled of diesel and old blood. When the doors finally hissed open, I wasn't met with the tropical paradise the recruitment brochures might have lied about. Instead, I stepped into a world of jagged steel and industrial blue. The facility, Designation 7 Alpha, rose out of the black crags of the island like a broken tooth. Above, the sky was a bruised, sickly purple, but inside, the light was a different kind of violence. Harsh, flickering fluorescent tubes hummed with a low-frequency static that vibrated in my molars. Everything was sterile, cold, and smelled faintly of bleach trying to hide something much more ancient and foul. Sarah met me at the primary airlock. She didn't offer a hand or a smile. She was a woman carved out of granite and cold calculations, her eyes reflecting the pale, neon glow of the overhead monitors. She looked at me not as a person, but as a component, a gear that needed to function without friction or fail. She tossed a thick, leather-bound folder onto a metal table. The sound it made was like a gunshot in the tomb-quiet hallway. "Sign the last page, Leo," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of warmth, echoing against the reinforced concrete walls. "Don't bother reading the fine print. You're here because you're desperate, and I am here because I need someone who won't ask questions when the pressure sensors redline." I picked up the pen. My hand shook, just a fraction. The debt was a heavy chain around my neck, pulling me toward the ink. If I signed this, the wolf at my door would go away, but I could feel the cold breath of a different predator in this room. The contract felt oily against my skin, like it was coated in the residue of a secret I wasn't meant to survive. One rule, Sarah leaned in, her shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor. The blue light caught the hard lines of her face, making her look like a ghost caught in a static transmission. "The facility is self-contained. Your quarters are pressurized. Your work is restricted to the inner hull. Under no circumstances, none, are you to enter the water. No swimming, no wading, no dipping your fingers in the surf to see if it is cold. You stay on the dry side of the glass. If you break that rule, your contract is voided. And out here, a voided contract means you do not exist anymore." I looked past her, toward a thick reinforced window at the end of the hall. Beyond the glass, the ocean was not blue or green. It was a churning, ink-black abyss that seemed to swallow the very light from a station. It looked heavy, like liquid lead, pressing against the station with a silent, rhythmic malice. I felt a sudden, inexplicable vertigo, a sensation of falling into a bottomless, wet throat. "Why?" I managed to rasp out, my throat feeling like it was suddenly lined with rusted needles. Sarah didn't blink. "Because the water here isn't just water, Leo. It is a grave that hasn't finished filling up yet." I signed. The ink bled into the paper, a dark stain that looked like a fresh bruise. The golden handcuffs were locked. I was a prisoner of my own poverty, trapped in a blue-lit cage surrounded by a screaming, silent sea. The static in the lights grew louder, a buzzing hornet in my brain, and for a moment, I thought I heard a faint, melodic thrumming coming from the walls themselves. It was a sound that felt less like music and more like a predator humming to itself in the dark. I was officially on the clock, and the rot was already starting to set in. The silence of the facility wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a physical weight, a heavy, velvet shroud that pressed against my eardrums until they throbbed with the rhythm of my own frantic pulse. Every glance from Sarah felt like a surgical dissection, her eyes sharp as scalpels, peeling back my skin to see if the debt was still festering in my guts. Her rule, the absolute prohibition of the tide, was a jagged line drawn in the salt, a boundary I found myself pacing like a caged animal in a room made of iron and bleach. "Never swim alone," she had warned, her voice a dry rattle of dead leaves. But the water was the only thing on this godforsaken rock that didn't smell like antiseptic and buried trauma. It was a dark, heaving mirror, reflecting a sky so crowded with stars it looked like a celestial bruise beginning to bloom over the horizon. I waited until the station settled into that deep, artificial midnight when the hum of the generators became the only heartbeat left in the world. I slipped out of my quarters, my boots clicking on the metal grates like a countdown to something irreversible. The air outside was thick, tasting of brine and something sweet and rotting, a heady perfume that made the static in my brain flare into a white-hot itch. I didn't head for the safety of the illuminated pier. Instead, I scrambled toward the western bay, where the cliffs cast long, skeletal shadows over the churning black. My curiosity wasn't a choice. It was a parasite, a slick, black thing feeding on the boredom and the mounting dread that filled my chest every time I looked at the redacted charts in the lab. The water didn't splash when I finally shed my boots and stepped in. It parted like wet silk, cold and unforgiving. It felt like mercury sliding against my skin, a freezing embrace that demanded total surrender. I waited out until the shore was a distant, dark smudge and the station's blinking red beacons were nothing more than dying sparks in the void. That's when the world shifted. A ripple appeared that didn't belong to the wind, a deliberate, serpentine movement that cut through the surface without a sound. Then, a luminescence began to bloom beneath the waves, a sickly sweet, pale green glow that looked like radioactive ink spilled into a well. It pulsed with the rhythm of a slow, subterranean heart, illuminating the depths with a light that felt ancient and predatory. She didn't swim so much as she glided, her movements a liquid grace that defied every law of physics I'd ever studied. Her skin was the color of a drowned moon, shimmering with that internal radiance, translucent enough that I thought I could see the dark, twisting shadows of her viscera beneath the surface. Dark hair trailed behind her in long, undulating ribbons, weaving through the currents like silk threads in a loom of shadows. My breath hitched, a lump of jagged ice forming in my throat. This wasn't a hallucination born of isolation or the nitrogen-heavy air. This was the source of the rot. This was something that had been waiting for the frequency of my fear to align with the frequency of the deep. She broke the surface 10 feet away. There was no gasp for air, no spray of salt, just a slow, deliberate ascent that made the water look like melting obsidian. Her eyes were twin voids, pits of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the moonlight and spit back nothing but the cold. I should have been terrified. I should have scrambled back to the safety of the iron walls and the fluorescent hum. But the curiosity was a hook in my jaw, pulling me toward her. She looked like a tragedy carved out of marble and seafoam, a beautiful, necrotized thing that had never known the warmth of a sun. The air between us felt charged with a sudden, violent static, a tension so thick I could taste the copper of a nosebleed on my tongue. The woman, if she could even be called that, tilted her head, the movement bird-like and unnatural. The bioluminescence pulsed beneath her collarbone, a rhythmic strobe that matched the thudding of my heart until I couldn't tell where my body ended and the ocean began. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to reach out, to touch that glowing, phantom skin and see if it felt like the void or like the velvet of a funeral shroud. The thrumming I had heard in the walls of the station was louder here, a melodic, guttural vibration that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my marrow. It was the sound of something hungry pretending to be a song. The water around me started to churn, small eddies of light swirling like miniature galaxies around my waist. The curiosity that had driven me into the bay was no longer a mental state. It was a physical compulsion, a sickness that made my limbs feel heavy and my thoughts feel like wet sand. I watched as she raised a hand, her fingers long and tapered, ending in nails that looked like shards of calcified glass. She didn't speak, but I could feel the shape of a question forming in the back of my mind, a query written in a language of salt and silence. I was a fly caught in the amber of her gaze, frozen by the impossible sight of a ghost-made flesh. The facility behind me, with its rules and its armed security and its sanitized secrets, felt like a dream I was waking up from. This was the reality, the cold, the dark, and the glowing entity that watched me with the patience of a mountain. I was standing on the edge of a jagged truth, one that Sarah had tried to bury under layers of protocol. The sea wasn't just water here, it was a living, breathing consciousness, and I had just walked right into its open mouth. I felt the first tug of the current against my ankles, not a pull of the tide, but a deliberate invitation, a psychic tether tightening around my soul. I leaned forward, my face inches from the surface, staring into the dark hair that swirled like ink in the glowing slurry of the bay, waiting for the ghost to show me what lay beneath the rot. I jerked back from the shoreline, my heels skidding through the wet, jagged shingle. The invitation from the deep wasn't a sound. It was a rhythmic pulse in the base of my skull, a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. I scrambled up the embankment, my breath coming in short, panicked rasps that tasted of brine and old copper. The station loomed above me, a skeletal silhouette of rusted iron and reinforced concrete against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. I didn't stop running until I reached the heavy pressure-sealed doors of the mess hall. Inside, the world was different, but no less suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of rancid grease and industrial-grade bleach, illuminated by the sickly, flickering glow of amber-tinted overheads. The shadows here didn't just sit in the corners. They seemed to stretch and lean, reaching out like long, withered fingers toward the center of the room. Old Tom was there, hunched over a stainless steel prep table that had seen better decades. He was a man who looked like he had been partially cured in salt, his skin a roadmap of deep, leathery creases and liver spots. He was peeling potatoes, the rhythmic scritch-scrape of the blade the only thing cutting through the oppressive static of the ventilation system. He didn't look up when I slammed the door shut, the metal booming like a funeral drum. I collapsed onto a plastic chair, my hands shaking so violently I had to tuck them under my armpits. The silence stretched between us, heavy and wet, until Tom finally paused. He didn't look at me, but his eyes followed the erratic dance of shadows on the floor. He whispered, his voice a dry rasp, like dead leaves skittering across a tombstone. He told me I had that look, the look of a man who had seen the silk in the slurry. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was lined with rusted wool. I finally managed to choke out a question about the girl, the glowing phantom that had nearly pulled me into the dark. Tom's knife stilled. He set it down with a hollow clack and finally turned his head. His eyes were milky, clouded with cataracts that looked like swirling nebulae of rot. He leaned forward, his face half submerged in the amber gloom. He told me that 20 years ago, this island wasn't a research station. It was a thriving village of men who knew the tides like their own heartbeats. But the sea isn't a resource, he hissed. It's a throat. One Tuesday, the horizon didn't just bring the fog, it brought the song. Every man in that village, from the boys just learning to cast nets to the elders who had survived 1,000 storms, simply stopped what they were doing. They didn't scream. They didn't struggle. They just walked. Tom described it with a terrifying, clinical detachment. They walked off the docks, off the cliffs, straight into the churning surf with their eyes wide and their mouths open in a silent, ecstatic O. They moved with a synchronized grace that defied their rough, calloused bodies. The women watched from the shore, paralyzed by a psychic weight that felt like lead poured into their veins. They saw their husbands and sons vanish beneath the waves, not fighting for air, but embracing the crushing void as if it were a lover. When the authorities finally arrived, there were no bodies, no wreckage, just empty houses and the smell of ozone and wet hair. Tom reached out, his hand trembling, and gripped my forearm. His skin was cold, unnervingly cold. He told me the research team didn't come here to protect the world from the water. They came here to study the predators that had turned this island into a larder. They are ancient, he whispered, his voice cracking into a jagged sob. They are the static in the radio, the shadow in the marrow. They don't want your flesh, Leo. They want the light in your head. The air in the kitchen suddenly turned frigid. The amber lights flickered once, twice, and then dimmed to a dull, glowing ember. A sharp, rhythmic click-clack of heels echoed from the hallway, a sound like bones striking stone. Sarah stepped into the doorway, her silhouette cutting a sharp, void-like hole through the dim light. Her eyes were hard, reflecting nothing, two black stones set into a face of pale marble. She didn't say a word at first, but the atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to spike, making my ears pop. She looked at Tom, and then at me, her gaze lingering on my damp clothes and the salt stains on my boots. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that threatened to crush the air from my lungs. Tom recoiled, his hand slipping from my arm as if he'd been burned. He turned back to the potatoes, his movements frantic and jerky, his mouth clamped shut so tight his lips disappeared. Sarah walked toward us, her presence bringing with it the smell of sterile laboratories and deep-sea pressure. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She simply spoke in a voice that was perfectly level, perfectly cold, a sound like a scalpel sliding through silk. She told Tom that his memories were a symptom of isolation, a necrotic rot of the mind that required correction. Then she turned to me. Her hand, gloved in thin black latex, came to rest on the table next to mine. She told me that the water was not a playground, and curiosity was a terminal illness on this island. She reminded me of my debt, the crushing weight of the money I owed, and how easily a man could be lost to a tragic accident in a place where the ocean swallowed history whole. She leaned in closer, the amber light catching the sharp angle of her jaw. She told me that what I thought I saw was a hallucination brought on by the nitrogen pockets in the old pipes, a lie my brain told itself to make sense of the isolation. But as she spoke, I noticed a single, crystalline drop of seawater fall from the cuff of her sleeve. hitting the stainless steel table with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in my mind. She wasn't just hiding the truth, she was part of it. She backed away, her eyes never leaving mine, and ordered me to my quarters. As I stood to leave, my legs feeling like they were made of water and glass, I risked one last look at old Tom. He was staring at his own reflection in a polished pot, his lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps a warning. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, a dark, rhythmic invitation that echoed the song from the bay. The station was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage built over a hungry, glowing abyss, and the bars were starting to melt. I walked down the long, dim corridor toward my room, the amber lights overhead flickering like dying stars, feeling the psychic tether around my soul pool just a little bit tighter. The ocean was waiting, and I could feel its cold, wet fingers tracing the edges of my mind, searching for the crack where the light leaked out. I didn't stop at my door. My boots clicked against the industrial grating, a rhythmic, hollow sound that echoed the pounding of my own pulse. The air in the facility tasted of recycled breath and ozone, but beneath it, the rot of the deep was calling. It was a scent like ancient kelp and drowned history. I moved through the shadows of the loading dock, a ghost in a machine that was built to keep things out, yet here I was, desperate to be let in. The exterior air hit me like a physical blow, salty, heavy, and thick enough to chew. The sky had bruised into a deep indigo, a shade of blue so profound it felt like a weight pressing against my retinas. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a jagged line of fire that was rapidly being extinguished by the rising tide. I walked toward the edge of the basalt rocks, my shadow stretching out like a long, thin needle pointing toward the heart of the abyss. I stepped into the water. It wasn't the shock I expected. It was a homecoming. The salt stung the fresh scratches on my arms, a visceral reminder that I was still made of meat and bone, but as the water rose to my waist, the static in my brain began to clear. The world above, the metal, the rules, Sarah's cold, analytical eyes, it all felt like a dream that was finally ending. I pushed off, my body slicing into the dark, liquid velvet. I swam until the shore was nothing but a smudge of grey against the indigo. Then I saw them. At first, it was just a pulse, a rhythmic, bioluminescent throb coming from the depths below. It wasn't steady. It was organic, like a lung-breathing light. The indigo water around me began to glow, shifting from darkness into a luminous, hallucinatory violet. And then she appeared. The woman from the bay. She didn't swim, she glided, her limbs moving with a grace that defied the density of the ocean. Her skin was the color of a drowned moon, pale and shimmering with a faint, oily luster. Her hair trailed behind her like smoke in a vacuum, blacker than the void from which she had emerged. She wasn't alone. One became three. Three became a dozen. They rose from the dark like bubbles of mercury, their eyes wide and lidless, reflecting the pulsating light of the deep. They circled me, a slow, predatory ballet. There was no splashing, no sound of water breaking, just the silence. And then the song began. It wasn't a sound that entered through my ears. It was a jagged intrusion directly into my prefrontal cortex. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles made of glass, vibrating at a frequency that turned my thoughts into grey sludge. It was a static that hummed with the weight of eons. It was the sound of the world before the sun, a rhythmic, thrumming vibration that told me my name was a lie, that my life was a flicker of dust, and that the only truth was the cold, pressurized silence of the trench. I tried to scream, but my throat felt like it was filled with wet wool. My muscles turned to lead. The enchantment was a physical thing, a thick, narcotic haze that wrapped around my spine and squeezed. I looked into the eyes of the woman closest to me. They weren't human. They were vast, dark mirrors showing me a version of myself that had already surrendered. I felt the rational parts of my mind, the engineer, the debtor, the man, crumbling like rotted wood. The indigo light pulsed harder, syncopated with the throb in my skull. Every flash of light felt like a hammer blow to my will. Come down, the song whispered without words. The pressure is a mother's touch. The darkness is a soft blanket. Let the water fill your lungs until you are as hollow and beautiful as we are. I watched my own hands drift away from me, pale and useless in the glowing water. I was no longer Leo. I was a scrap of drift, a piece of detritus being reclaimed by a god that didn't know mercy. The water felt thick, like syrup, dragging me down by the ankles. One of them reached out, her fingers long and translucent, touching my cheek. Her skin was freezing, a cold that burned like acid, yet I leaned into it. I wanted the rot. I wanted the void. I wanted to stop being the man who owed the world and start being the ghost that the world had forgotten. The light intensified, a blinding, rhythmic strobe that turned the ocean into a cathedral of violet fire. I felt my heart rate slow, mimicking the pulse of the sea. I was sinking now, my feet pointing toward the floor of the world, my eyes fixed on the glowing entities that danced in the updraft of my own bubbles. The static in my head was a roar now, a beautiful, deafening white noise that drowned out every memory of land. The island was gone. Sarah was gone. There was only the indigo, the light, and the long, slow descent into the mouth of the ancient mother. The water tasted of iron and ancient salt, a metallic tang that coated my tongue like a film of oil. I could feel the pressure starting to mount against my eardrums, a dull ache that seemed to harmonize with the rhythmic thrum of the psychic song. It was a jagged sensation, like being torn apart by silk ribbons. My lungs burned, but the pain felt distant, an echo from a life I had already discarded. I watched a string of silver bubbles escape my lips, rising like a prayer to a sky I no longer cared to see. The entities were closer now, their bodies overlapping in a kaleidoscopic swirl of pale flesh and indigo light. They didn't touch me with malice. They touched me with a terrifying, mindless curiosity. I felt a hand on my shoulder, another on my hip, guiding me, tilting me further into the vertical drop. Their skin felt like wet marble, slick and impossibly smooth, lacking the friction of anything living. Look at the light, the song commanded, a jagged vibration in my teeth. Forget the sun. The sun is a lie told to those who fear the deep. We are the truth that was here before the first spark, and we will be here when the last star flickers out into the black. The word rot drifted through my mind, but it didn't mean decay. It meant the breaking down of the ego, the softening of the hard edges that made me a person. I was rotting away into the ocean, becoming part of the brine, part of the ancient, rhythmic machinery of the abyss. The static in my brain was beautiful. It was the sound of a television tuned to a dead channel, a roar of pure, unadulterated nothingness that felt more like home than any house I had ever lived in. The indigo grew darker, the violet pulses becoming sharper, more aggressive. I could see the outlines of things below me, monstrous, skeletal shapes of things that had died millions of years ago, preserved in the cold, silent grip of the deep. They were waiting for me. We were all waiting. The enchantment was complete. I closed my eyes, allowing the weight of the water to become my skin, allowing the rhythmic light to become my heartbeat. I was a ghost in the making, a hollow vessel ready to be filled with the dark, wet secrets of the sea. Every inch of my skin felt like it was being mapped by invisible needles. The psychic song had moved past my mind and into my marrow, vibrating my bones until I felt like I was made of nothing but glass. The entities moved with a predatory elegance, their faces flickering between beauty and something primal, something that had seen the continents drift and the mountains crumble. Their eyes were voids, sucking in the rhythmic light and reflecting it back as a promise of eternal, mindless peace. I felt the last of my resolve snap like a dry twig. There was no fear, only a profound, visceral sense of belonging to the dark. The void was calling, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the fall. I was the fall. I was the sinking stone. I was the water itself, heavy and ancient and cold. The static reached a crescendo, a high-pitched whine that threatened to shatter my skull, and I welcomed it. I opened my mouth to let the ocean in, to let the indigo light fill the spaces where my soul used to be. The rhythm of the light was my only compass now, a heartbeat that didn't belong to me, but to the thing that lived beneath the world. It pulsed, thrum, 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 a jagged, electric heartbeat that demanded total surrender. And I gave it. I gave it everything. I gave it my debt, my name, my memories of the sun. I was drifting in the psychic abyss, a speck of dust in an indigo galaxy, waiting for the final, cold embrace of the deep. The facility was a fever dream, a metallic scab on the edge of a world that didn't want it. Sarah's warnings were the chattering of insects. Old Tom's stories were the rustling of dead leaves. Here, in the belly of the deep, there was only the indigo pulse and the weight of the water. My skin felt translucent, as if the light was shining through me, exposing the fragile, useless machinery of my organs. I was a visceral mess of meat, but the song was turning me into something else. Something ancient. Something that didn't need to breathe. I saw the woman again, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were a map of the stars that had long since burned out. Her mouth didn't move, but the song intensified, a jagged, static-filled roar that tasted of salt and copper. Mine, it hummed. Mine. The rhythm was everything. The light was everything. The indigo was everything. I was gone. There was only the abyss, and it was singing my name in a language I had forgotten before I was born. The water was no longer an element. It was a state of being. I felt the pulse of the ocean floor, a rhythmic thrum that matched the flicker of the entity's skin. The violet light was a veil, pulling back to reveal the true face of the world, a cold, beautiful, and utterly indifferent void. I was enchanted by my own destruction. I was in love with the weight that was crushing me. The static was a lullaby, a jagged, visceral song that promised the only thing left worth having, the end of the self. I felt my body tilt, my head pointing toward the crushing dark of the trench. The entities surrounded me like a shroud, their cold fingers tracing the lines of my throat. I didn't fight. I didn't want to. I wanted to be a part of the indigo. I wanted to be the rhythm. I wanted to be the light. I was sinking, and for the first time, I was exactly where I was meant to be. I was lost in the psychic abyss, and the song was the only thing that was real. The light pulsed one last time, a brilliant, blinding indigo, and the world above vanished into the static. I was deep. I was gone. I was theirs. The rotors of the transport helicopter cut through the heavy, salt-laden air like a serrated knife, but I couldn't hear them. All I could hear was the fading echo of that silent, indigo vibration, the hum of the things that lived beneath the bay. Sarah stood on the landing pad, her silhouette a sharp, jagged outline against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. She didn't wave. She didn't look away. She simply watched as the distance between us grew, her eyes two cold chips of flint that knew exactly what I had lost. Beside her, old Tom was a slumped, grey shape, his lips moving in a prayer or a curse that the wind swallowed whole. My contract was a shredded memory, my bank account was bloated with silence money, and my mind was a fractured mirror, reflecting nothing but the dark. The mainland was a shock of unwanted colour and noise. I fled from the coast as if the tide itself were a reaching hand. I drove until the smell of salt was replaced by the scent of dry pine and baking dust, settling in a high-altitude town where the air was thin and the clouds were the only things that held moisture. I lived in a room that smelled of stale tobacco and desperation, a monochrome existence where every day was a battle against the memory of the water. I stopped taking showers. The feeling of water sliding over my skin felt like 1,000 needles, a cold reminder of the fingers that had almost pulled me into the obsidian void. I washed with sponges, shivering in the dry heat, my eyes always tracking the sky for the first sign of a storm. 5 years of isolation followed. I was a ghost haunting my own life. I worked as a night janitor in a dusty archive, a place where the only thing that moved was the static in my head. I avoided mirrors because I didn't recognize the man staring back, a man whose skin seemed too pale, whose eyes seemed to hold a permanent, liquid shadow. I was a noir cliché, the broken witness to a crime that didn't exist in any ledger. But the marking was real. I could feel it under my ribs, a cold, rhythmic pulsing that synchronized with the moon. It was a psychic rot, a piece of the deep that they had planted inside me like a seed. The package arrived on a Tuesday, a day of oppressive, overcast grey that made the world look like an old photograph left in the rain. It was a heavy manila envelope, damp to the touch despite the dry mountain air. There was no return address, just a smudge of sea salt and the faint, unmistakable scent of the research station's antiseptic hallways. Inside was a dossier, the paper yellowed and brittle, stamped with classifications that shouldn't have existed. Sarah's handwriting was on the cover, a frantic, jagged scrawl. They don't forget. I spent the night huddled under a single flickering bulb, reading the words that confirmed my nightmares. The entities weren't just animals. They were the architects of the abyss, ancient predators that didn't hunt for meat, but for the resonance of a human mind. They were psychic parasites that marked their prey with a frequency, a tether that could never be cut. The dossier spoke of the fishing village, of men who had walked into the waves with smiles on their faces, their brains turned to static by the siren's hum. They were waiting for me. They had been waiting for 5 years, watching the clock of my life run down, knowing that eventually, the water would come back for its own. The storm hit 3 days later. It was a monstrous, gothic upheaval of the sky, a wall of black clouds that turned the afternoon into a midnight of swirling rain and jagged lightning. The mountain roads became rivers of mud and slate. I had to leave. The pulsing in my chest had become a scream, a demand to be closer to the source. I was behind the wheel of my rusted sedan, the wipers slashing uselessly against the deluge when the world tilted. The tires lost their grip on the slick asphalt, a hydroplane that felt like a slow-motion descent into a dream. The car skidded toward the edge of the coastal cliff I had tried so hard to avoid, and for a heartbeat, I was airborne, a silver speck suspended in a void of falling water. The impact with the ocean was a thunderous, bone-shattering roar. The windshield imploded, and the freezing Atlantic rushed in, a wall of cold that felt like coming home. As the car began its long, spiraling descent into the dark, the lights of the dashboard flickered and died, leaving me in a tomb of rising obsidian. I struggled against the seatbelt, my lungs burning, the panic a frantic bird trapped in my chest. And then, the glow began. They were there, drifting out of the gloom like phantoms made of moonlight. Dozens of them, their pale skin shimmering with that horrific, beautiful indigo light. Their hair trailed behind them like ink in a glass of water, and their eyes, vast, dark pools of ancient intelligence, locked onto mine. The song started then. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical weight, a vibration that bypassed my ears and shattered my willpower. It was a lullaby sung by the void, telling me to stop fighting, to let the water fill my lungs, to become part of the silent, eternal chorus at the bottom of the world. The car creaked, the pressure of the deep pressing in on the metal like a giant's fist. One of the entities drifted closer, its hand pressing against the shattered window. Its fingers were long and translucent, and where they touched the glass, the indigo glow flared. I felt my grip on reality slipping. The pain in my chest, the cold, the fear, it all began to dissolve into a blissful, static-filled nothingness. I wanted to give in. I wanted to sink until the sun was a forgotten myth. But then, the mark flared. It was a different kind of pain, a jagged spike of raw, human agony that cut through the psychic fog. It was the memory of Sarah's cold eyes, of old Tom's warning, of the 5 years of dusty, dry survival. It was a rejection of the void. With a scream that was nothing but bubbles, I slammed my elbow into the door frame, the jagged glass tearing at my sleeve, the sharp sting of physical injury snapping the psychic tether. I clawed my way out of the sinking wreckage, kicking against the crushing weight of the water, my eyes fixed on the distant, churning surface where the lightning flickered like a dying strobe light. The entities didn't pursue me. They simply hung there in the dark, their glowing forms a constellation of predators, watching me with a patience that was more terrifying than any attack. They knew. They didn't need to catch me today. I breached the surface, gasping for air that tasted of salt and electricity, my fingers catching on a piece of floating debris just as the searchlights of a rescue boat cut through the rain. The paramedics at the hospital talked about shock and hypothermia, their voices a distant mumble through the static in my ears. They didn't see the indigo tint in my veins. They didn't hear the hum that still vibrated in the marrow of my bones. I survived the crash, but as I lie here in the sterile, white light of the ward, watching the rain beat against the window, I know the truth. The dossier was right. The marking is permanent. Every puddle on the sidewalk, every glass of water, every storm that rolls in from the horizon is a doorway they are holding open for me. I am a marked man in a world made of water, and for the rest of my life, I will have to fight the urge to simply walk back into the waves and let the song take me. The ocean doesn't have a heart, but it has a memory, and it is waiting for me to come home. The rain doesn't just fall anymore. It hunts. It seeks out the heat of my skin with a cold, predatory intent, each drop a microscopic scout sent from the grey void above to remind me of what waits below. I move to the high desert, a place where the earth is a parched, screaming throat and the air is a desiccated husk, yet the moisture in my own breath feels like a betrayal. Every glass of water I pour is a calculated risk, a shimmering trap that vibrates with that familiar, subsonic hum. When the light hits the surface of a simple bowl of soup, I don't see my reflection. I see the flicker of a pale, gelatinous limb. I see the strobe light glare of an eye that hasn't evolved for the sun. I see the rot. It began the moment they pulled me from the surf, my lungs burning with the brine they had tried to force into me. The paramedics spoke of shock and hypothermia, but they couldn't feel the static. They couldn't hear the way the wind through the ambulance window sounded like 1,000 voices whispering in a dead language. They didn't see the way the shadows in the corner of the ER shifted, mimicking the sway of kelp in a bottomless current. Sarah stood by my bed for a single minute, her face a mask of jagged exhaustion and cold professional distance. She didn't offer comfort. She offered a warning. She told me that the mark isn't on my skin, though the skin where they touched me has turned a translucent, waxy white that never tans and never heals. The mark is in the architecture of my brain, They rewired the nerves. They tuned my consciousness to a frequency that only the abyss broadcasts. The dossier she left behind was a litany of ghosts. It spoke of civilizations that predate the crust of the earth, entities that view the land as a temporary protrusion of filth soon to be reclaimed by the tides. It detailed the symptoms of the marked, the sudden drop in body temperature, the recurring dreams of falling through liquid mercury, the irresistible urge to walk toward the sound of a running faucet. But the dossier didn't mention the smell. It didn't mention the scent of ancient, stagnant salt and decaying coral that fills my house whenever the humidity rises above 10%. It didn't mention the way my own sweat tastes like the bottom of a trench where no light has ever touched. I don't sleep in a bed anymore. I sleep in a chair, upright, as far from the plumbing as the walls will allow. I've disconnected the pipes. I use bottled water, sealed in dark plastic, and I only open it in the scorching heat of the noon sun. I look at the bathtub and see a doorway. I look at the sink and see a grasping hand. Even the moisture in the air is a medium for their song. It's a low, grinding vibration that starts at the base of my skull and works its way down my spine, turning my marrow to slush. It tells me that the desert is a lie. It tells me that the sand is just the ground-up bones of things that thought they could escape the sea. Sometimes, when the lightning strikes the distant mountains in the middle of a dry storm, the strobe effect peels back the reality of my living room. For a fraction of a second, the walls are gone. I'm not in a house in the middle of Nevada. I'm suspended in a lightless column of water, miles deep, and they are all around me. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Their skin is the color of a drowned moon, their hair drifting like smoke in the dark. They don't have mouths, but they scream. They scream in a way that bypasses the ears and rots the soul. They tell me that the car crash wasn't an accident. They tell me that the water didn't just happen to be there at the bottom of the cliff. The water rose to meet me. The ocean reached up its billion-gallon arm and plucked me from the sky, and it will do it again. I spent 6 months in that research station watching the waves, but I was the one being researched. Sarah and her team weren't protecting the world from the creatures. They were tending to a garden. They were the keepers of the bait. And I was the one who bit the hook. Old Tom was right. They never forget. A human mind is a flickering candle in the dark, and once they've tasted the heat of your thoughts, they follow the trail of your warmth through the cold of space and time. They are patient. They have the patience of a tide that takes 1,000 years to grind a mountain into silt. They know that eventually, the rain will fall. Eventually, the pipes will burst. Eventually, my body, which is 70% water, will yearn to return to its source. Every morning, I check my eyes in the mirror. They are getting lighter. The pupils are widening, becoming hungry for a dimness the sun can't provide. My skin feels tight, like it's a suit that doesn't fit anymore, a garment I'm itching to shed. I find myself standing in front of the locked bathroom door for hours, listening to the drip of a faucet I know I tightened. Drip, drip, drip. It's a countdown. It's the sound of a clock that measures eternity. They are on the other side of that wood, waiting in the half-inch of stagnant water in the U-bend of the pipe. They are waiting in the clouds. They are waiting in the very blood that thrums in my veins. The struggle isn't a physical one. It's a war of attrition against the will to exist as a separate entity. The song is so beautiful now. That's the most terrifying part. The jagged, screeching horror of the first encounter has smoothed out into a velvet lullaby. It promises an end to the heat. It promises an end to the weight of gravity and the stinging bite of the wind. It promises a silent, weightless grace where the dark is a blanket and the cold is a kiss. I have to scream just to remember my own name. I have to press my hands onto the hot, dry stones of the desert floor until the skin blisters just to feel something that isn't the phantom pressure of the deep. I know how it ends. I see the ending every time I close my eyes. I'll be driving, or walking, or simply sitting in a chair, and the sky will open up. Not a storm, but a deluge. The world will become a blur of grey and blue. The air will thicken until it's unbreathable. And I'll stop fighting. I'll open my mouth to the rain and feel the ancient, psychic rot fill my lungs like gold. I'll walk into the rising flood with a smile on my face, because the song will be the only thing I can hear. The ocean isn't a place, it's a predatory consciousness, and I am a stray thought it is finally calling back to the void. Until then, I sit in the dust. I wait. I listen to the clouds. And I pray for a drought that never ends, knowing all the while that the sea is just a few miles beneath the dirt, waiting for the first crack to appear. The water always wins. The water is the only thing that lasts, and I am already half drowned.